True North Politics time now. Starting with news, the Prime Minister will be heading to Asia on Sunday for a 4-day trip to China to talk about trade, climate change, human rights. Trade is going to be front and center, though, because remember, Canada's trying to figure out what is going on with the NAFTA free trade agreement with the States and whether Donald Trump will walk away from it. And if he does, even if he doesn't, it's important, of course, to hedge your bets and have friends all over the world. And so to China, Justin Trudeau will go next Sunday. Joining us for more to give us their take on this, we've got Will Stewart from the Conservative side of things in Toronto, NDP commentator Sally Hauser standing by in Regina, and we've got Tim Barber in Ottawa with a Liberal point of view. Tim, let me start with you. What's at stake here for the Prime Minister in this trip to China?
Well, it's a second trip to China, and I think it's a very big deal. It's a massive economy, which we have over the past 30 years or even 40 years, back to when the Prime Minister's father first went and was one of the first Western countries to create diplomatic relations with China. But, you know, I was working with the Canada-China Business Council in the mid-90s. Successive governments through the Chrétien years and the Martin years have tried to really break into that market in a very significant way. I think back to the Team Canada missions of 94, 96, 98. And we tried our very best at, you know, growing that relationship. I checked the numbers before I came over. In terms of exports, you know, the U.S. is still, you know, king of the hill with about 82% of our exports at over $400 billion. China is still around only 21 billion a year. So as massive as that economy is, it's now either tied for first place with the U.S. globally in the world. It's really important for us. The other thing I would just say, in my experience, China really likes Canada. And I think we've got a really amazing opportunity to take advantage of that relationship. But the reason I put up the figure of 400 billion versus 21 billion, we suffer from the U.S. economy being so close and so easy and so accessible and rule of law. And to replicate that, you know, I know we're going to speak about NAFTA a bit later on, but it's not that easy. And I think it's going to take a long time. If we think somehow, you know, if President Trump turns off NAFTA, we're going to be able to turn on the China relationship, like, you know, turning on a light switch. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and it's going to take a long time before we replicate what goes on in terms of Canada-U.S. trade.
We're going to show the tweet that Justin Trudeau sent out not too long ago about this trip as well, talking about strengthening the relationship between the two countries. Will Stewart, what do you think?
Well, look, I think it's great that that Trudeau is out there and trying to raise the two items. Human rights abuses, obviously, in China, and trade. But I think what's more important on that tweet and on the Prime Minister's statement on the weekend is what's not in there. What's not in there is the words free trade, which is something that this government campaigned on. It's something that Trudeau mentioned the last time he went to China, but is noticeably absent now. Of course, Trudeau is also coming off of two major fumbles on the international stage with the misreading of his schedule and missing the big TPP announcement. Of course, TPP is a competitor to a free trade agreement that China is trying to put together. So I'm wondering if that misreading of the agenda was actually on purpose or not, as part of one way for Trudeau to make nice with his Chinese hosts. Of course, the other fumble was on human rights as well in the Philippines, where Trudeau quite rightfully mentioned that the human rights abuses that are taking place there actually need to be raised and need to be concerned. We need to be concerned about it. So good for him for mentioning it. But the head of the state in the Philippines had some pretty negative words to say for Trudeau. So that was two major issues that he had on the world stage that I'm sure he'll be looking to put behind him on this trip to China.
What about you, Sally?
You should wear that as a badge of honor, by the way. Sorry, Sally.
Go ahead, Sally.
Yep. You know, I think what's interesting is Trudeau and the Liberals today talking about they're going to be bringing up and speaking about a progressive trade agenda. And I sometimes wonder if the Liberals just kind of throw that word around, progressive, without really thinking about what it actually means. Obviously, they've mentioned human rights as an issue that needs to be brought up. That has been brought up, I think, a lot of times. We've seen Canadian dignitaries go to China, although not much has changed. But in addition addition to human rights, I think you also have to talk about, if we're talking about trade, talk about labor standards, talk about safety in the workplace and manufacturing. I don't think he can be really talking about out of both sides of your mouth. Obviously, it is one of the biggest economies in the country, but at the same time, if we're frankly going to be putting the jobs of manufacturing sector in Canada at risk, then it certainly can't be, by transferring this over to China, which has much more lax labor standards and also human rights violations.
All right, let's talk about NAFTA, because round 5 wrapping up. We now know round 6 will be held in our country in Montreal in January, so about 6 weeks or so, perhaps longer. It's sort of a big period now for all 3 sides to go home and kind of recalibrate, rethink their position. It's turning into a bit of a NAFTA nightmare. And Chrystia Freeland, you see here, of course, our point person on this, trying to figure out what is the path forward. We should point out, of course, the Trump administration may be very skeptical about these sort of trade deals, but they are getting a lot of pushback within their own country by Republican senators, Republican congressmen and governors, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, of course, as well, all saying, hold on a second, NAFTA is very important to our country. Tim Barber, how do you think this plays out now?
Well, I do think what you had just mentioned is the Trudeau strategy and the Trudeau government strategy working. It's getting mayors and premiers engaging with governors and local officials, both in cities, states, in Congress. I think we're doing as good a job as we can on the ground. And look, I've said to you before, Todd, that this president, to call him unpredictable, I think is a bit of an understatement. He needs a win. I'm not sure what that means. And I am worried in the sense that, if this tax package, which is insane, doesn't go through, is this the next target? Is this his next potential win? So I'm really worried, but I must say that I think that my colleagues will agree that we're doing everything we can in terms of engagement, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say as well.
Will, what do you make of this all back and forth, all the melodrama?
Yeah, look, I'd love to blame the Justin Trudeau government for the failings of NAFTA should it come to pass. But the reality is Tim may have been the king of understatement here when he says Donald Trump is unpredictable. The challenge here is we are not conducting trade negotiations with the United States in a reasonable manner. We need to be thinking about things differently. I mean, just looking at my province of Ontario, I think it's responsible for over 40% of our trade in an economy that has already gone from being the economic engine of Confederation to the caboose. And we're going to be hit even harder should NAFTA fail. This is a major trade agreement. But I think, as any deal maker knows, anybody who's even bought a new car knows, the secret to any good deal is your willingness to walk away from the table. And if we don't get a dispute resolution mechanism in the new deal, and if we don't have some measure of sanity on American content, autos. Canadian content on autos, I think that, we have to walk away from it, as terrible as that is. Thank goodness we have CETA, of course, without the benefit of the UK. We might have TPP if Justin Trudeau can read his schedule properly into the future. We might have something with China. But all of that is our big mites when we live next to one of the biggest economies in the world that we are heavily dependent on.
So round 6, Sally, in January in Montreal, going to be very frosty outside of the meeting hall. What about inside? What do you think?
Well, I think frosty would be an understatement. I'm going to absolutely agree with Tim here. With the volatility at the presidential level, engaging at the state level and the municipal level has absolutely been the smart way of engagement. Any kind of multi-nation negotiation such as NAFTA is going to be fraught and very difficult, and get progressively so as you go through the round. So now that we're kind of deeper and deeper in, it's naturally, the points of contention are going to show themselves much more. The problem is it started at such a tense situation that it's really getting down to some very difficult brass tacks here now. The other thing that needs to be considered is that we're coming into a Mexican election in July. That might actually, because it's looking like the left or center left, but probably a little more left party in Mexico may win. And so that may well kind of get the Americans and Canada, and certainly the current administration in Mexico, into gear a little bit to really try to hash things out.
Sally Hauser in Regina, Tim Barber in Ottawa, and Will Stewart in Toronto. Great to have all 3 of you with us today on this Monday on CTV. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you, Todd.